Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by SAMHSA's GAIN Center with the support of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Today's webinar is Mitigating Behavioral Health Disparities Using Culturally Relevant Approaches to Support Native American People who are justice involved. We have three presenters today, Violet Cloud, Winona Stevens, and Janelle McFeet, and I will introduce them shortly. I am Erica Ihara, and I am a project associate at Policy Research Associates and SAMHSA's GAIN Center for Behavioral Health and Justice Transformation. And I have a few housekeeping items to cover before we start the presentations. First, our disclaimer. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. If you have any questions for the presenters or in regards to the technology, please use the Q&A pod, which is located on the right of your screen, and we will be queuing up your questions that you type in during the event for the end of today's session, and we will address as many of your questions as we are able in the time that we have. We also will be conducting a couple of polls, and so we appreciate your participation in these. When you see a poll pop up on your screen, if you'd like to enter your responses, we do appreciate hearing from you. This webinar is being recorded and the slides will be disseminated via the GAINS listserv following the webinar. And we will also notify you via the listserv that when the webinar recording is available on SAMHSA's YouTube channel. And we have a certificate of attendance today that will be available for download at the end of the webinar. Please note the certificate is for personal portfolio use only, and we do not offer CEU credits for today. We have American Sign Language interpretation for today's event. And if you don't already see the ASL interpreter on your screen, you can go to Layout, which is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, select Hide Non-Video Participants and change the layout view to full screen. Finally, select View All. And we have two interpreters today. Their names are Justin Anderson and Jim Brown. We have live captioning for this event. And to view live captioning, select the Accept button in the Multimedia pod, which is in the lower right of your screen. And the color contrast of the live caption pod can be adjusted as needed. We recommend high contrast style for best visibility. And next, I would like to introduce today's agenda. So after I complete these introductions, the presentations will follow, and we have reserved time at the end to address questions from folks in the audience. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Violet Cloud is Project Associate at Policy Research Associates and SAMHSA's GAIN Center for Behavioral Health and Justice Transformation. She is an attorney and a researcher based in the state of New Mexico with expertise in tribal law. And she is also trained as a clinician with a focus on the treatment of substance use disorders. She is currently completing her doctorate in psychology at the University of New Mexico. And at the GAIN Center, she is responsible for the planning and delivery of national technical assistance and training to improve outcomes for people with behavioral health disorders who have criminal justice involvement or are at risk for criminal justice involvement. Violet Cloud is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, and she is descendant of the Southern Ute tribe. Winona Stevens is Executive Director and founder of Native American Reentry Services. Her organization has two programs, which are the Iron House Medicine, and this is a Department of Corrections programming taking place inside prisons in the state of Washington, and HEAL, which is a reentry program, and we'll be hearing about that work today. She is a trainer for White Bison's Warrior Down and Medicine Wheel 12-step curriculums, and she is a recovery coach for Mending Broken Hearts, which provides supports for healing from intergenerational trauma. She holds a governor's appointment as the Tribal Affairs Representative for the Washington Statewide Reentry Council, and she serves on the University of Washington's Native American Advisory Board. She has a master's degree in social work from the University of Washington. Winona Stevens is a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. Janelle McFeet is project manager and strategic planner for the Second Chance Act community-based adult reentry grant at the Port Gamble S'Klallam Tribe. She currently leads the community partnerships for Transitional Solutions Reentry Task Force and the Port Gamble S'Klallam Welcome Home Program, which is a human dignity reentry model. She has worked for 2 decades in this field with expertise in reentry, case management, victim advocacy, restorative justice, tribal probation, and court services. She implements strategic planning for human dignity reentry models and holds numerous certifications, including certifications for trauma-informed care, White Bison 12-step medicine wheel, and restorative circle practice. She has received numerous recognitions for her innovative work, including a nomination for the White House Champion of Change Award. And Janelle McFeet is descendant of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. And now I would like to share some observations about who is participating today in the audience. So thank you to everyone who wrote in to let us know where you're calling from. It looks like the majority of our audience today is calling from urban locations, followed by rural locations, and then suburban locations in the smallest group today. And we have people from the judiciary, people who work in policy, corrections, probation and parole, crisis services, community-based organizations, and government, and a couple of you who are checked the other box. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us, and we'd like to welcome everyone. So now I would like to turn it over to Violet Cloud to begin the presentations. And Violet, over to you. Thank you for kicking off today's discussion.
Thank you, Erica. Hello and greetings to all of you joining us today. I am so grateful to be here with you. In my 15 minutes, really probably 10, I have a lot to cover, but before getting into that, it's important to me that you have my context so that you can appreciate the limits of my expertise. My heritage is mixed. On my mother's side, I'm an assortment of European descent. On my father's side, I'm an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation through his mother, and a descendant of the Southern Ute tribe through his father. I was not raised in either of those traditions. However, I'm extremely proud to be a descendant of both. I feel that my existence is proof to the resilience of our people. I share this for 2 reasons. First, knowing whom you receive information from is an important exercise given how much information we are receiving every day. Excuse me. Second, given today's topic, I want to clarify that I'm not the authority in this area, and I want to respect the wisdom of those with more accurate knowledge. It's a perfect segue to my first slide, where we recognize that this population is incredibly diverse. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. That means that there are at least 574 variations of what it means to be Native American. So as I speak today, and as the other presenters talk, keep in mind that not all tribes or Native American people share one culture, one tradition, or one language. When discussing this population, it is necessary to specify some terminology. For those that don't know, the term Indian is considered a legal term of art. This means it is statutorily defined and has legal significance. In this way, it is to be an American Indian is to have a unique political status within this country. Throughout this webinar, you may hear me use the terms Native American, American Indian, and Alaska Native almost interchangeably. I apologize for the confusion. I gravitate towards Native American because I am most comfortable with it and because I feel it's a bit more inclusive term. Individuals don't need to be a member of a federally recognized tribe. They may be a member of a state recognized tribe or a tribe that's attempting to obtain that recognition. The term American Indian, Alaska Native is specific to federally recognized tribes. And we could go into way more detail on this topic, but that's a different webinar. Another interesting fact, actually really relevant to the population of viewers we have today, is that majority of Native American identified people are living in urban settings. So when we imagine and visualize the life and existence and culture of American Indian and Alaska Native people or Native American people, we think often that they live in very vastly rural and impoverished communities, where the population is actually most represented is in our urban communities. So just thinking about that, letting it kind of letting it affect your visualization of this population. Excuse me. In the following slides, I'll walk through some data on Native American populations and the overlapping worlds of criminal justice and mental health. As I walk through this data, I hope you'll keep in mind that there are challenges of data interpretation and limitations to consistent data collection. One of them being, how do you identify an individual? Is it American Indian, Alaska Native? Is it Native American? Do you account for individuals who are a descendant but not a member? These are issues that we see in the data that we have. I offer this data presentation as a conversation starter and plan not to persuade you strongly toward any specific interpretation. This slide describes the prevalence estimates of mental health and substance use among American Indian, Alaska Natives, and the total population. Make note that this is not a criminal justice population. This data comes from a 2019 national survey on drug use conducted by the Center for Behavioral Health Statistics and Quality. For those of you that don't know, prevalence estimates are calculated using number of cases in a sample and accounting for test sensitivity and specificity to create a confidence interval. This data shows us that the rate of co-occurring substance use and severe mental illness among American Indian and Alaska Natives has dropped from 2.4% to 1.5%, and similar drops have been seen for alcohol use and illicit drug use for those same years. As for the total population, that drop is not as perceptible. Another takeaway from this slide might be that except for the co-occurring substance use and mental health, severe mental illness, the prevalence estimates for American Indian Alaska Natives is lower than the total population. However, take this point with a grain of salt because the sample size of the Native American population in this data is quite small compared to the larger sample. When we look to the data from criminal justice populations, we see higher rates of mental health. This data comes from the 2016 survey of prison inmates produced by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This report was published by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2021. For me, the significant takeaway here is the difference between state prisoners and federal prisoners and their rates of mental illness. I don't have an interpretation for this, but it does make me question the effect of potential, I guess, the charges involved, the length of sentencing involved. Different factors may be playing a role, but it does seem clear that there's a difference in the rate of mental health for state prisoners versus federal prisoners. I recommend looking at the full report when you have time, and we will provide you links to the information I'm showing you today. If you're interested, it provides some racial breakdowns. So although you can't see it here, the rates for mental health for American Indian and Alaska Natives are said to be higher than the average. However, again, grain of salt, the margin of error was wide enough to account for that difference. For example, the estimated prevalence of mental health history among American Indian and Alaska Natives in state prison was 50% compared to total sample of over 42%. And the margin of error was over 5%. My takeaway here is that the increased rates of mental health among criminal justice populations in general. until we're able to really get quality data on Native American populations in our criminal justice system, it's really hard to say what's going on. This slide, however, gives us a little bit more sense of that racial breakdown. The table comes from Bureau of Justice Statistics publication on data from the annual survey of jails years 2010 through 2018. As you can see, there's a considerable overrepresentation of Black and American Indian and Alaska Native populations in our local jails. This brings us to the need for getting cultural competence into the criminal justice system. In 2014, SAMHSA published a tip on how treatment providers and organizations can improve cultural competency in service provision. I believe that extending these practices to the criminal justice system would benefit all involved. With this resource, our criminal justice system can improve their cultural competence practices. With that, I would like to share a couple high points from this document. Again, it'll be shared in our resources. First, it's important to think about why would we do this? From this document, they go into detail about why it's beneficial and efficient to implement such practices. For example, based on prior work and the research done by the report authors, it was found that programs with culturally competent programming have better outcomes for those who are served. For criminal justice populations, that might be recidivism rates and improved mental health, which is a key point in this work that we're doing here. Another benefit would be that the programs were seemingly more sustainable. And one of the reasonings for that was that there was less staff burnout for organizations that maintained cultural competence practices. The document also provides how we develop culturally responsive programming. A couple examples would be that you hire staff that are self-aware and who are able to practice cultural humility. If you can't find them, you train them. They also recommend that you explicitly acknowledge the impact of race, ethnicity, and culture on individual experience. Finally, I think it's important that we have staff in our criminal justice system that respect the diverse cultural backgrounds of all citizens to whom they come into contact. With that, my final slide, I'd like to thank you again for listening to me and for your attention today for the rest of the speakers. And it's my pleasure to now introduce our next speaker, Jaylene McFeet, a descendant of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe and a representative of the Welcome Home Reentry program.
Thank you, Violet. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, hopefully. So I just want to say it's so nice to be couched between Violet's presentation and Winona's presentation. Violet brings a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the research piece, and Winona brings a wealth of knowledge to working with individuals, Native American individuals in the prison setting, and she really gets it when it comes to bringing that cultural component into the prison setting. So I'm so honored to be here today with these ladies and with this impressive audience that we have. So my name is Janelle McFeet. I'm a Jamestown S'Klallam descendant, but I work for the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe. I am the Reentry program manager and strategic planner for the Welcome Home program that we'll be talking about today. So I was thinking about this last night, and for those of you who are tuning in today, I'm hoping you'll consider something different when it comes to working with our Native American folks that are incarcerated, or in general, our justice involved folks. So, you know, as we know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and getting the same results. So why not try something different? Why not try to take away something from this presentation today, even if it's a small step? We tried something different within the Welcome Home program, and we reduced our recidivism rate by 81% with our target population using this reentry human dignity model. The reason why I bring that up is because it's not just, it's really important to have results as well. And so we are the only tribe in the nation to receive 2 back-to-back Second Chance Act grants, and we are hoping, cross our fingers, for a third. That grant would work with reducing recidivism through a community collective. And basically what we'd be doing is helping train the Kitsap County community that we're in, that we live in this reentry model. So being able to train volunteers in the model that uses global best practices, restorative practices, that is relational, less clinical, that's rooted in human dignity, and focuses on Native American ways of healing. That would be our hope, is that across the state of Washington that we live in, that jails and prisons can replicate this model, and across the nation. I'd like to point out with this next slide, this might be a little bit difficult to see. This is our brochure, the Welcome Home program, is that because we had such success with our first grant, and we also worked with our local Suquamish tribe with our first grant, this is now offered to Native and non-Native individuals because we believe so strongly that Native practices can be a universal way to heal. And that's where I really wanted to start off this morning, is with a quote from Chief Seattle. So I'm here in Washington State, so is Winona. So this is one of the quotes that I use often. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. So when we start to understand that we're all connected, we can start to really see each other. And that's when amazing things happen. And that's when we can start to incorporate things like relationship building into this reentry arena. That's when we can bring in culture, community, talking circles, restorative circles, and bringing in that ability to understand people's trauma. And that's when we can start to see real change. I want to give you an example of real change. But before I do that, I wanted just to take 1 second to read from the chapter of Compassion that writes about this talking circles. And circle work is a huge part of what we do. And so the chapter for Compassion writes, the talking circle is a traditional way for Native American people to communicate and to even solve problems. By allowing people free expression in the sacred space of the circle, those encircled are empowered to find their voice and to feel heard and supported. The talking circle is an exercise in equality. The circle itself is considered sacred, and all who are within its parameters are honored as equal in importance, and all are embraced as spiritual beings with inherent wisdom. I'm going to keep this slide up for actually a few minutes because with all the unrest in the last year or two, all this racial divide, we really started to think about how could we bring something so beautiful to the greater community. And that's when we partnered with our local dispute resolution center of Kitsap County to put on what you see up there on the screen. It's called Community Listening Circles. We strongly believe to either start a reentry program or to enhance it, you have to have people talking. We have to be able to see each other. And I think that's where we're failing right now. And so these circles have brought people together. So we have justice involved individuals, law enforcement, the BIPOC community, elected officials, the greater community. We have everyone joining in on these conversations and developing relationships. And I think that's what is so important, because then we can ask the tougher questions in a respectful manner. You know, we can ask questions like, what does that systemic racism look like in the justice system? What are some changes that we need to bring to the justice system? Everyone gets a voice. That's the most important. So up here on the slide, this is pre-COVID, so I'm just gonna make mention of the COVID situation. We have now moved everything to a virtual platform, still bringing, dispute resolution has done a great job bringing in our local Native music and pictures and centerpieces to a virtual platform. So we still continue to do these. So on the right-hand side, you see the circle, the community listening circle, and on the left-hand side, you'll see our flyer for our Tribal Law Enforcement Community Learning Series. This is really important. It's not just for our tribal law enforcement here locally, it's also for our non-tribal law enforcement. We partnered with Kitsap Strong to put together a deeper dive video series for our law enforcement officers to understand more about trauma-informed care and historical trauma. Carolyn Hartness, who I believe is on the line today or on this call, works with us and has a lot of experience in this arena. And when she's actually interviewed in one of these videos, and she talks about historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, microaggression, and how this all plays out in the Native community by increased use of drug and alcohol use, health issues, whatever it might be, it's piling up. And we just haven't found a way to make it better. And we need to do better, justice-involved professionals. And for those of you who know me, that's hard to say. I don't like conflict, but we need to do better. Another thing we can do to do better is to provide restorative circles. So what we do is we work with the individual that comes out of incarceration, the victim of the crime, family, law enforcement, community, tribal community, and we bring everyone together. And that gives that individual a time to make amends, time to heal. And that's why we actually titled it the Welcome Home Project. We wanted to completely flip the script and what you see in traditional settings and actually have it be a welcoming and a celebration. And I think that's what a strength-based program looks like. And so, I keep hitting the wrong, there we go. So hopefully the takeaway, this is our beautiful centerpiece that we use both on site pre-COVID and then virtually as well. And so hopefully the takeaway from this is when we are working with individuals that are incarcerated, especially our Native American population, Indigenous population, is relationships matter. Storytelling runs deep in the Native community, and being able to build relationships is the most important. Everything else is secondary. And then we can get to the stuff that is more evidence-based. And you see up here our risk and needs assessment that we use. This is the Correctional Assessment for Intervention Systems. This is used actually throughout the country in a lot of progressive in jails and prisons. This measures whether the client is low, moderate, or high risk to reoffend. And the problem there is most correctional facilities will just stop there. And we would like to go a step further. So this, and I'll read from the slide, but it produces a customized and comprehensive report with recommendations for case planning and identifies general supervision strategies to be used and risk and needs levels. So a lot of the time, hey, great, it spits it out, gives you some information, but you can't stop there. And that's really important to point out. And so we provide something called the Wheel of Wellness. And I'm going to actually skip to this slide. So this is when, and Carolyn Hartness again does this the Wheel of Wellness for our clients. And she asks them to imagine themselves at their best, spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally. And that's important. And if they're not ready at that time, they help, Carolyn helps cast that vision for them. And I think that's important to talk about, is we just don't want to stick with these kind of traditional linear models. And so once we get the results from the risk and needs assessment, we get the results from the Wheel of Wellness, get the results from that substance abuse disorder assessment and the mental health assessment, that's when the coaches, and I'm going to talk about them later, and they're the key to our success, will sit down together and put together an individual service plan. The other part, advance to the next slide, is including that cultural piece into the individual service plan. So research indicates, and Winona will talk about this, involvement in culture helps to reduce recidivism. And so here, the canoe journey participation is really big. We're here on the coast. For those of you, I'm not sure where the audience is exactly from, but we're, I guess, in the Seattle area. And so that coastal piece is really important, that canoe journey. Bringing in talking circles, salmon and clam bakes, beading, drum making, as you see a picture there on your right. And so bringing in that cultural component is so important. Because this is a native and non-native program, the other thing that we've adopted pre-COVID was bringing in individuals, participants that were recently released. And I'll give an example. We had someone bring in from our community how to make fry bread. And then we had someone who was of Filipino descent make lumpia. And so we know in Indigenous communities that food is bonding. So we're bringing people together through food, through culture, and really seeing each other, and just a beautiful process. I'm not sure if Val Jones, our other success coach, is on the line, but she also, her idea was to bring this on a virtual platform as well and do cooking classes, and everyone share something from their culture. So last but certainly not least, our success coaches. We do not use the word case manager for a lot of reason. There's research behind that. They sit between a peer mentor and a clinician. They're not your typical case manager. As you see, all the things that they're trained in: motivational interviewing. They're trained in, they're restorative circle practitioners. They're trained in trauma-informed care. They understand historical trauma. The list goes on. They also, some of our success coaches are recovery coaches as well. And they're trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and the other things that we already went over, which is the criminogenic risk and needs assessment, the Wheel of Wellness, etc. So you can look up on the screen and see everything that they're trained in. I believe this is a huge part of why participants are successful. Participants are successful because our coaches genuinely and authentically know how to connect with the client. And we do a lot of work with Brené Brown, and she does a lot of work with connections. And she defines connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from their relationship. And that is what our success coaches do. I believe most of them are on the line. And if you guys are, you're absolutely amazing human beings. I will end with this. And because I have notes, I'm going to read it straight. This beautiful Native American reentry model can be universal and used in all cultures. The most important aspect is we respect one another's culture and way of life and honor that, even if those people are behind bars. That is the human dignity way. Nelson Mandela said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. So if a Port Gamble S'Klallam tribal member, a Jamestown S'Klallam tribal member, or Suquamish tribal member is incarcerated or in prison and they need to sweat, let them sweat. If they need to drum, let them drum. If they need to sing, let them sing. When we introduce this type of healing and move away from these linear institutionalized models, we all win. So thank you for letting me share, and I'm going to pass it to the wonderful Winona Stevens, and I will now mute myself. Thank you so much.
Winona Stevens Hingaire. Greetings to you all. I'm glad to see you all here today. My name is Winona Stevens, and I descend from Ho-Chunk and African American grandmothers and grandfathers from Black River Falls, Wisconsin, Winnebago, Nebraska, and Olathe, Kansas. I currently reside on the lands of the Puyallup tribe, who are known as the Generous and Welcoming People. Our organization is home to 2 programs that provide support for our relatives involved in the criminal justice system. The Iron House Medicine Program, which is a religious services contract with the Washington State Department of Corrections, and Heal for Reentry, which provides an Indigenous reentry approach for our relatives as they return home from incarceration. Here's some information, some statistics about what our population looks like. While the American Indian Religious Freedom Act protection includes our relatives in Hawaii, the statistics shared on this slide represent the people of Turtle Island that are incarcerated within the Washington State prison system. As shared by Violet earlier, there is an overrepresentation in incarceration of tribal people in comparison to what our population looks like out in the community. In Washington State, our groups are pretty diverse and inclusive of other Indigenous people who relate to our community, our familial structures, so they connect in those familial ways. It's common for our powwows, which is our annual religious event, to include Mayan or Aztec groups representing South American people, haka from our Islander brothers and dances from our relatives from Southeast Asia, for example. Our hoops are very much representative of the medicine wheel in our state. So this is kind of what our people look like in the Iron House. There's trauma, mental health concerns and issues, substance abuse concerns. In the normal course of events, by that I mean pre-pandemic, our relatives in the Iron House have struggled with intergenerational trauma, institutionalization, and substance abuse. The work that we do both during incarceration and as they return home into the community provides an outlet, a way to maintain the connection to the Red Road. In regards to mental health, involvement in cultural and traditional activities improves outcomes by refocusing our clients on pro-social efforts, reducing engagement in risky behavior, enabling clients to contribute back to family. All of this encourages positive relationships. Some examples of institutionalization that show why it's vital to address institutionalization and reentry includes dependence on the structure of the institution and struggling without it. Continue to use exploitive norms that are part of the prison culture. Hypervigilance, diminished sense of self-worth and personal values, and PTSD, stress reactions to prison experiences. Those examples of institutionalization kind of sound a lot like historic trauma. In substance abuse, the challenges that our relatives face, recovery and maintaining your walk on the Red Road can be challenged by reentry. We've had a lot of brothers and sisters who have been fearful to go home back into the community. They're required to go back into the community, and that's the place where their issues began, their struggles began. Support The reentry, their Red Walk, by incorporating traditional practices and activities as part of your reentry program. We encourage our relatives to surround themselves with those who are where they want to be. And we use the White Bison's Medicine Wheel and 12-step program and Healing Forest model to see where they are, where they were, and where they want to be, to look at how you plant yourselves in your community. Are we planting ourselves when we return home in anger, guilt, shame, and fear into this toxic community? Or are we going to plant ourselves and surround ourselves, the people around us, the activities we do, the way that we engage with our families in love and healing, tradition, and ceremony? So it's important for our relatives during incarceration to have access to Indigenous programming. I'm an admirer of Dr. Maria Yellowhorse-Braypart and her method of using education, sharing the effects of trauma and grief resolution through collective mourning and healing to address intergenerational trauma. Prison hoops need more resources and education about the true history of Indigenous people in the Americas. Too many people grew up with incorrect history, not understanding the trauma they inherited. Understanding will lead to healing and resilience. Our organization's programs, the Iron House Medicine and Heal for Reentry, uses Medicine Wheel and 12-step, not just for education, but to encourage their walk on the red road. Our Medicine Wheel and 12-step programs are largely peer-led, and they apply cultural teachings to influence the attitudes, behaviors, values, and intent of the participants. While Mending Broken Hearts, we only use in our reentry program, but it addresses intergenerational trauma and family healing. Restorative justice is an important part of the work that we do in our Iron House Medicine program. Our hoops have giveaways. They are very actively engaged statewide in giving back to the community. Some examples include our brothers at Airway Heights. In the past, they've created traditional gifts, regalia, dream catchers, beadwork, and they've given these to children, organizations, and supported the local community. The Washington State Penitentiary, when families weren't able to do giveaways for in ceremony when laying a loved one to rest or having giveaways in the communities for their young one, they provided community items, beadwork, regalia, and all manner of things to support that person. Coyote Ridge provides teddy bears that they make to the Yakima Tribal Police Department for the children that they run into in their interactions in the community. Traditional practices are very important. They're vital during COVID. When the pandemic struck, as many here who work in the criminal justice system know, the corrections systems, prisons, work releases, everyone went into strict pandemic response. We were fortunate that we have program elders who have been a part of this criminal justice system here in Washington State and are aware of policies and procedures and how they impact our religious groups who are practicing our ways in DOC. And they responded by looking at ceremony and making sure that we could continue to do ceremony while being mindful of the OC's pandemic protocols. Another thing that we try to do is to help our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated know what are the tribal responses that are happening in the community. Without much information and connection, they feel very alone, feel very isolated, not knowing what's happening in the community around them. And it helps to know that the tribal response is similar to what's happening and what they're experiencing during their incarceration. We've been very fortunate in our program, the Iron House Medicine program, with our contractors. Our contractors are such passionate people. In the beginning of this pandemic, when everyone else was shutting down, when people were isolating and quarantining, our contractors were getting out there, getting on the road, going into prisons, making themselves available to our incarcerated relatives. It's beautiful work that they do, and there's no one who has as much passion as our contractors do. We've also been blessed by the hard work of the religious coordinators who are employed by DOC, not only supporting our programs, our incarcerated relatives, but many religious programs and religions that are cultural programs and religious programs, across the state juggling to keep these things going as volunteers and sponsors were not able to access in the early days of the pandemic. So the COVID impact on our people, it's been pretty traumatic. This statement here from this a client of ours, you know, he said this in response to what happened with you before you came home. He was talking about his brothers that he was incarcerated with. The impact on programming in DOC has been significant. And this has led to a reduction in access for not only families, but volunteers. So many programs that were supported by volunteers have not happened in the last 18 months. It's led to an increase in workload for the programming staff that are there. It's been very challenging for our allies and stakeholders in DOC to do the work that they need to do, keep morale up, address the pandemic. It's been very challenging all the way around. Another thing that has been challenged by the pandemic is connection. Visitation has ended. Annual activities and programming that families used to be able to come to have stopped. There's cultural isolation. For a while, we lost Sweat Lodge. We're not able to gather with each other the way that we used to, and that's vital to tribal people. There's a disconnection from families, and communications have been a challenge. And a part of COVID is grieving. We have a lot of people who have lost loved ones during their incarceration. They've not been able to go home and be a part of that ceremony of laying that person to rest. And dealing with that trauma and grief and loss during incarceration has taken its toll on our relatives who were in the Iron House. Another thing that has been a source of stress has been the lack of information. They don't have access to the internet. They don't have a lot of control over the information that they get. So lack of information has been stressful to our people in the Iron House. So, you know, reentry is a challenge for those who are working with our people. Historically, the Native American community has been challenged by reentry. In our state, as I showed in the earlier slide, our recidivism rate is 44.5%. That was prior to the pandemic. We use White Bison's Warrior Down as a model for our community reentry and outreach. The key to success with Warrior Down is networking and relationships. For example, our relationship with our state's reentry division is giving us an opportunity to connect with community corrections staff. These are the people that are working directly with people as they're transitioning out of prison. They don't know what they don't know about tribal reentry, about resources that you can have this resource because you're enrolled in a federally recognized tribe, but you're a descendant, so you don't have access to those resources. What's available if you live on reservation? What's available if you live in an urban setting? Many times I've come across people who are trying to help individuals release into the community, and there's assumptions about what we have as tribal people. So being able to have that relationship with the reentry division is going to allow us to educate about what's available, what's not, and what's the best way to identify those resources and to be able to provide those resources for them. Our tribal community is a significant part of our reentry work. We get support from local tribes, from urban tribal resources, and most importantly, from our brothers and sisters who've come home from prison. They come home from prison looking for a way to give back to the community. And this is where our support comes from. Our biggest support comes from in our program. The COVID challenges in reentry, you know, a lot of people were unprepared for how quickly they released. There have been a lot of changes in our state. It's been defined, there was an effort called the Rapid Reentry Effort, which led to a lot of people being released to address the space in pandemic issues within the prison system. And communications and access to corrections have been a challenge. Family resources and community resources, identifying those things, reentry planning have been a challenge. To support rapid reentry, we need to be able to address restrictions faced by our brothers and sisters who are on community corrections, who are still on supervision. And to be prepared to do that, that again speaks to the relationship that we have to have with our stakeholders within corrections and within community corrections. Reentry begins on day one. It's not day one from coming home from prison. It's day one of beginning incarceration. Our relatives in the Iron House who may never come in, they're a vital part of our reentry. They're a part of the education process. Many have become peer facilitators in our Medicine, Will, and 12-step program. Their role is important because they're the ones who are in the front row watching the revolving door of our youth going in and out of prison. They're the ones who are poised to make a difference. Our elders, contractors, and volunteers who bring ceremony, religious coordinators, and DOC staff who are stakeholders and allies in the work that we do, all play a part in preparing our relatives for reentry. Our community, our tribal stakeholders, our allies, but most importantly, our brothers and sisters who've come home and are willing to reach back into the prisons and provide us support, some love, some caring to our brothers and sisters who are right behind them coming home. They're the only ones who can do this the way that they do it because they've been there. We have several programs that we use in this work. We use Medicine, Will, and 12-step both in our Iron House and our Heal for Reentry program. We use Mending Broken Hearts in our reentry program. And we use Warrior Down as a guide to how we network with our communities and stakeholders around us. All of these things provide opportunities to continue teachings and for the growth of our relatives in the community. I thank you all for your time here. I would like to say that it's a blessing to do this work. I would encourage you to reach out to your local prison, your local work release, those who are supporting your relatives who've come home. It's a blessing to do this work. And I guess if you feel compelled to do it and you haven't done so, I would encourage you to do so because it feels good going and visiting with our brothers and sisters in the Iron House, to laugh with them, share with them, break bread with them, dance with them, sing with them. It's a beautiful experience. And if you've not been able to do so, or if you've been thinking about doing so, I really encourage you to take the opportunity to at least check it out to where you are, because it's a wonderful gift to be able to take care of our people in this way. Hina Gigi, Hanichachewe.
Thank you. And I'd like to just, before we move over to the Q&A session, I'd like to thank our three presenters, Violet Cloud, Janelle McFeet, Winona Stevens. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on this topic today. And I look forward to jumping into the questions that we have from the audience now so we can hear some more. For the audience, if you have not already entered your questions for the panel, please go ahead and do so. You can use either the Q&A pod or the chat, and we will be collecting those. I'm going to kick off with a question that for anyone on the panel who would like to speak to this, if you could share a strategy that behavioral health or criminal justice professionals can think about using for people who are not necessarily based in a tribal community. What are strategies that these professionals can think about to be able to offer some of these approaches for the people they work with, whether that's screening people to find out whether they have a tribal affiliation, or potentially referring someone who might be interested in accessing these types of approaches to support their recovery, and maybe they're not a tribal member. So I'm going to open that up to the whole panel and for whoever would like to respond.
Hi, Erica. I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I'm going to rephrase. So I think the question is, what recommendation is there to folks who are potentially in urban communities or not directly in a reservation or an Indian country or tribe affiliate, have a tribe affiliate? What would they do to make sure that they're attending to individuals who are Native American in their court system? Is that the correct interpretation of your question? I'm gonna say
Just
yes.
reading it here. Yeah, I think that is part of the question. So if you'd like to speak to some of the things that are needed to establish connections and relationships to make it possible to be able to offer culturally specific approaches to people who might not be living in an area where that is readily available.
Absolutely. I think I could just give a couple ideas. So one is there's always going to be the issue of resource availability. So funding for these sorts of programs or implementing these sorts of culturally responsive programming, getting the training for staff, the things that I mentioned, those are really really challenging. And even for non-tribal affiliates or state court systems, they can still implement these programs and access funding opportunities to support this work. And one of the reasons why I had a slide on why we should do this was that you can support the funding and argue for funding for this kind of work by showing that it's beneficial both to the program and beneficial to all the people you serve. So this is like a strategy that I think is really important to get the work into a space where people can actually start implementing it. When I think about getting culturally relevant treatment services or any kind of service provision to folks who are Native American or have a traditional cultural background, I think it's really important to hire people. So representation in the staffing, if you can outreach to people who have that experience, so that people, when they enter your organization, they have a face that they recognize. They have someone that empathizes with their background, their experience. So just a couple ideas that I would recommend.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Would anyone else like to add, or shall we move to the next question?
I would like to say it's important to connect with the individuals who we're serving. A lot of times the approach that tends to be taken with our people, it's the same approach, assuming we're doing the same practices. And if you can reach out to the individuals that you're going to be providing these services to in your community, you're going to find out what specifically what their needs are. And if you don't feel like there's a connection to the community they might be a part of outside of the relationship with them, through them is a connection to that community as well.
Thank you for that. Winona, this is a good segue to a question that we received specifically for your group. Someone in the audience would like to know, first of all, if all tribes in Washington State are participating in the community outreach component that you discussed. And in addition, they are looking for referral information that where they can offer as a resource some of the programming that you talked about today. So I'd like to ask if you'd like to put your website or other contact information in the chat, that would be great. And if you could address that first question about whether all tribes are participating in the community outreach in your state.
There's a lot of reentry efforts that are happening here in Washington State. I work with Janelle. She invited us to be a part of her program when she started her Second Chance grant. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work, a lot of clients for all of us. We can't compete for clients because there's so many people in need. It's important for us to all support each other in the work that we do. And so the way our organization, the way our program addresses reaching out to the community and supporting clients is through the client, as I mentioned earlier. We look at their individual needs, the community that they're going into. And then we look at the resources that are available to them, as well as connecting them to their tribe if there are resources available in that way for them. Sometimes that's a struggle with our people in the urban Indian community who are far away from their home. When it comes to connecting and providing resources with tribes, we reach out to them when we have one of their tribal members as a client. So if anyone wishes to reach out to us to figure out ways to support the program and additional clients and their tribal members in the Iron House, we can do that as well. I can put, you asked me to put our website into the chat, which I can do right now. I hope I answered the question. Is there anything that I missed?
That covers it. Thank you, Winona. Next question is for Janelle. So someone in the audience would like to know about where they can access information on applying the circle model that you had presented on. And so is there anything additional that you could share today pointing them to any resources where they might be able to think about implementation? And feel free also to put your program information in the chat.
Sure. I was going to say a lot of this is really detailed and kind of condensing, 10 years of work into 10 minutes. So if anyone would like to talk to me, I'll put my information in the chat. One thing I'd say is there's a lot of restorative circle practitioner trainings. And if you get trained as a restorative circle practitioner, you can bring this back to your community. I'm not sure where you're located, but here in Washington State, we worked with dispute resolution of Kitsap County, but they're throughout the state of Washington. I'm sure there's something like that in other states. And so you get trained on basically how do you craft those questions, who comes to the table. It's a very thoughtful process, and so it takes a minute to put together. And I love that question because I'm an advocate for starting small. I'm an advocate for pilot projects and test runs. And so this is a really easy, in my opinion, simple thing to bring back and to try and just say, hey, could we try putting on a restorative circle or a community listening circle after you get trained in it? But I could definitely talk to you more in detail about what that looks like, but I always think that's a really good first step.
Thank you, Janelle. So this question is, I think, for anyone who would be interested in addressing it. Someone would like to know if restorative justice as a practice is born out of Indigenous culture or cultures. So would anyone like to take that question?
I don't know that it's born out of Indigenous cultures, but I think it feels natural when we do the work that we're doing for our people to give back. Part of the work, part of the work that we do in our prison programs is around giving back to the community, and a lot of our people use that to address wounds that they've inflicted on the community that they've come from, and to provide healing for themselves as well.
I can't, without going into major legal law history, say too much, except for recognizing that our United States system is adversarial, and that structure is designed that you have two people on two sides of the aisle arguing to get to the truth. The restorative justice principle comes from actually many other non-Western, non-US styles of legal practice, where the goal is more for community harmony and community healing, and not so much for looking for who did wrong and how do we punish them. And so I wouldn't say that anybody really gets to own that. I do think that there are tribes and Native American communities who in their history, that is their legal kind of practice. But I think other communities that are non-American also followed that kind of legal practice.
And I was just
Thank you,
going to
Violet.
add
Yes, go
that
ahead.
all Indigenous cultures resolve things in a communal fashion. This is something that's been deeply rooted in the Indigenous and the Native American culture. So this is something, whether that's restorative or in a talking circle or whatever that might look like, but that's definitely something you see throughout the Indigenous cultures.
Thank you. Thank you. So, okay, we've got quite a few more questions. I'm going to start with, well, let's start with Janelle and Winona for this next one, specific to the reentry work that you do. So can you speak to any, okay, so the question is, do the reentry programs provide alternative places to stay instead of having to return to the same environment that a person was in prior to incarceration?
I think what we've seen from prison corrections is a little different because when you're releasing from the state DOC, there's something called the county of origin where your crime was committed. That's where you release back to. And so there are some avenues for changing what that is, but I believe for the most part, most people release into that county of origin. Not sure how much control there is over that on their side, but as far as providing alternative places to stay, it's a challenge for I think all reentry programs. I'm sure Janelle will agree. Housing is a struggle. You know, not only is it a struggle for in our community right now here in Washington State, rent is sky high. You know, the cost of living, the wages that people make, and make it a challenge to afford that. The other challenge that our people face when they come home is applying for an apartment and not having a rental history, not having a long work history. All of those things that they look at making you a good renter are challenges and trying to establish a place. But finding places to release to, we're more of a grassroots organization. And so, you know, we don't have the financial resources to pay for first, last, and deposit to get someone into a place. But even when that's provided, it's still a challenge to find a place that's affordable and to, with your background and lack of rental history and lack of income history, lack of work history, for people to get homes, to get places to stay.
And I'd have to say, you know, to piggyback off what Winona's talking about is, yes, it is a struggle, but it's not impossible. And we work with our wheelhouse is in the jail system, right? So it's a little bit different than the prison system. And so we have something, and all tribes have something called Appendix X funding. And so we usually tap into that for first month's, you know, deposit in first month's rent. And what I would say, and I'm going to go back to this a lot, is that starting small and pilot projects and developing relationships. And so over time, when you start to develop relationships with the people that are connected to this, you know, housing agencies and stuff, and you start to figure out the ins and outs, and you have success coaches that are working diligently with the client, and you have those Appendix X funds, you know, we're able to find housing right now. It's not always easy, but when you have a team that's all dedicated to that here in Kitsap County and you're working towards the end goal of housing, because if you don't have somewhere to live, that creates a that creates a problem. So we work with our local Oxford houses. We work with an agency called Homes of Compassion. We work with our Housing Solutions Center. We work with the tribe, both tribes, and we have Appendix X funding. So we definitely make that a huge priority. It's like the first thing the success coaches are working on. And we work in, what I failed to mention is this is pre to post release. So we work with the jail. So they have them filling out the housing packets and we start to have that conversation early on. So it's intense.
Thank you. Okay, this next question I'm going to give to Violet to kick off. Someone wants to know about, is there a lack of mental health resources or services for Native American people? And if so, how does this affect the probability of justice involvement and mental health issues? I know this is a huge question, but would you be prepared to give a couple of comments on that question?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. I think this is a really great research question that we could look more closely at. Just based on my experience, I do know that the availability of mental health service, quality mental health services within rural areas and tribal communities is a bit harder to come by, but that doesn't mean that it's totally inaccessible. So we could make the correlation that that would affect the mental health stats of this population, but I don't know that we could then also make the correlation that that has an impact on the numbers of criminal justice involvement. However, thinking back to the slides that we were looking at, we do see that in the reverse, when there's criminal justice involvement, there is an increased likelihood of mental health problems, but that's an issue of, causation, which direction does it go? So great research question, something we should definitely look into.
Thank you. Janelle, this next question is about restorative circles. Someone wants to know, does the circle interact or address addiction behaviors in the same way, using the same methods as when you are working with a circle that has community members who are victims of a crime and the person who committed the crime? So do those two circles look the same in terms of how what the approach is?
Sure. And Erica, I actually just wanted to jump back on to Violet's question really quickly, because
absolutely.
When we're working and she made a comment too, some of the like we work with Kitsap Mental Health, and some of those services don't really work for our Native American population. So when it comes to our Port Gamble, S'Klallam, Tribal, and Suquamish members, we make sure that they're getting that from the wellness center at the tribes. And the other thing that we've done, because we've noticed that those traditional, more traditional counseling settings are not a good fit for our Native American population. So that's what we've incorporated into our programming. Part of that is the talking circles, which Carolyn Hartness puts on, our restorative circles and the cultural classes, because that helps with that mental health piece. Now, I know if it's bipolar or schizophrenia, that's a little bit different, but we definitely infuse that. And I wanted to make a point of that, where it's mental health programming for our Native American population. So I just want to put that out there. So the question was about the restorative circles, and could you repeat that? Sorry.
One moment, I'm just scrolling through to find it. So the question was what the two settings that you talked about for using restorative circle practice. One scenario that you talked about where you're addressing addictions, and then another setting where you're working with people who were victims of a crime as well as the person who committed the crime. This person wanted to know if you could share about how those circles might look different, or if they're essentially the same, like if the method of running the circle is the same in those two types of scenarios.
Sure. The method is the same. The community listening, so we have a community listening circle and the restorative circle. The method is always the same. And so, so when we work on this and we have work groups before we actually put on the circles, we're aware that the restorative circle is bringing in potentially the victim of the crime. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's a representative of someone who's been through something like that. Family, success coaches, law enforcement, etc. And we craft these questions for everyone that's at the circle. So it mirrors a talking circle. You have a talking piece. You answer the question that's addressed to you, and then you pass it around. And then the community listening circle is a little bit different. We're doing this simultaneously, purposefully, and strategically, because we believe that the community listening circle is starting to build relationships with law enforcement. There's massive, there's not a lot of trust there right now, especially with what's a recent shooting of Stone Child out of here locally by a white officer, and there's a lot of hurt behind that. And so what we're trying to do is bring people together from all walks of life to have conversations and to be able to recognize everyone with trauma that has a story, whether that's the officer, whether that's someone who's justice involved. And so we're building that piece, and then we bring that same group and that same law enforcement to the restorative circle. So we have these twice a month, and we make sure that we're kind of building relationships and building healing. And so that's a really quick version of what we do, but it's a little more detailed than that.
Thank you. So the next question is I'm going to start with Winona. So this is from someone who runs a prison-based treatment program that is not a culturally specific program. And this person is asking, what is something I can take back today to my direct care staff that they can consider to start increasing culturally specific approaches?
I guess one of the questions that I would ask is, what is your connection with people once they leave the treatment center? Do you have a reentry program? If you do, how do you stay connected with those who are doing well? Those who are doing well, are they able to be recovery coaches and support your current clients? Engage in talking circles. It's something you can do right now. We've even done that virtually. Engage in talking circles. One of the talking circles that we do at the Washington State Penitentiary, or at least before the pandemic, is using the Red Road to Sobriety book. It's something that I've seen available in a lot of different treatment centers. So it might be something that you have on hand. You know, pick a topic, pick a chapter, do talking circles. I would encourage participating in a training like White Bison's Warrior Down, with learning how to connect with tribal communities, stakeholders, allies. What does it look like? What does a support system look like for our brothers and sisters in the community to help maintain their sobriety and their recovery? And what are other curriculums that are offered? For example, we use the Medicine, Will, and 12-step. And I really believe the best leaders for those programs are our brothers and sisters who've gone through that. So identifying recovery coaches and people in the community who can lead those efforts and lead those classes. Because people stay connected when they come home from prison. They stay connected and that support system is out there. In regards to treatment, I imagine it looks very similar. A lot of treatment centers are doing talking circles and offering these classes. Start a conversation about establishing a sweat lodge. Connect with some traditional people in your community to run that, to pour that, to make sure that you're doing it in a good way and doing it correctly. Um, those are just some things off the top of my head that you could do at a treatment center setting.
Thank you, Winona. And we've got a couple of questions about some of the concepts that you used today and the terminology, Iron House, Red Road. Just to clarify, can you refer our audience today to where they can look up those terms and understand the history and what they mean?
I think you can go to our website. Also, we work with Hoyt, based out of Seattle. Hoyt Cares, HUYCARES.org and whitebison.org. They're probably more terminology than those two things, but the Iron House is just our way of referring to the prison. But when we say Iron House, we're talking about like the prison or jail. And the Red Road, it's the road that you're walking, through life. How are you walking? How are you going through life as an Indigenous person? And that Red Road is like that sacred road, that traditional road that our ancestors have walked before us and that our descendants will walk after us. And it's around tradition and ceremony and our culture and our traditions and our ways are a part of our walk and how we're moving forward in life.
Thank you. Okay, this next question is about people who are Native American, who are justice involved and have children. And it's two questions here, so I'm going to try to tease these out. The first question is, so I think specific to what Janelle and Winona talked about today regarding the programming. So are you including the issues around child support in the discussions and in the work that you're doing? So that's one question. And then the second question, and I think this is, I'm going to ask this question of Violet, is is there a piece of advice that states can think about to, remove obstacles for people who have children who are justice involved and also Native American? So let's start with the programs first. So Winona, I'll start with you and then we'll go through the panel.
So when you ask how are we including child support issues, I assume you're not just talking about financial child support, but also just the relationships, the family relationships. One of the gains that our program was able to make, well, not necessarily our program, but in the formation of our program in the beginning back in 2011, we had, our annual event in DOC is a powwow. And there are programs in DOC that allow for children to come into facilities to encourage that bond between the parents and the children. Unfortunately, our powwow was at one of those activities where children were able to attend. And we had our community supporters and brothers and sisters from other organizations, specifically Gabe Galanda from Hoyt, at Galanda Broadman, and Minty Longer from United Indians of All Tribes Foundation. They created a way for our children to be able to participate in powwow. Powwow is not a powwow without children. And so it was something that was long needed and encouraged. And the way that our program works on our Iron House Medicine program, that's the one time a year that we're able to support our children, and our brothers and sisters work throughout the year to take care and gift their family members when they come. In our reentry program, we encourage those traditional activities that help people maintain their sanity during their incarceration, ceremony, sweat lodge, the teachings they have in our Wilbrighty curriculum, to include their children in those programs. So when we hold those activities, children are welcome, children are invited. It's a blessing whenever we see a brother or sister who comes to attend our reentry sweat and they bring their children with them. This has an impact on intergenerational trauma. This parent is teaching, their child something that brought them healing in their life and encouraging the use of tradition. In regards to looking at child support, like financially, a lot of our people have LFOs or legal financial obligations in which they are required to make payments, a certain like deductions out of their income while they're incarcerated and while they're out in the community. So part of our goal is we want to encourage taking care of our children. At the same time, when we're helping people look for work and employment, we want to make sure that we look at positions that are paying enough so that they can take care of their children, their legal financial obligations, and that they're able to live a good life as well.
Thank you, Winona. Janelle, any comments you would like to make on addressing the needs of people in your program who have children?
Sure, and I was also gonna mention that we have a reentry task force meeting, and that happens every month, the last Friday of every month, and we're lucky to have on our co-leadership team an individual that works directly with child support. He's actually in Pierce County, and so we get a lot of those updates. And so it's finding a balance between supporting the children, but also understanding that these individuals are incarcerated, and that creates a problem. So they've done great work here in Washington State. Tara Simmons as well, a state representative that was recently incarcerated herself and has been a total advocate for our program, has also done a lot of work around that. What I want to say in regards to the children is that they're always welcome. And I did want to just give a plug for, and I was talking to Winona about this the other day, Stephanie Autumn, who's our TA provider for the Second Chance Act grant, is putting on a training, and it's the Indigenous Family Decision-Making Model. And what that does, it's a nice blend to our circle work, because it's bringing in the family as well to plan, and that part includes the children. And so sometimes, depending on the content that's going to be shared, children can attend the restorative circles, but we kind of have a screening process just in case it's a little too much for them to handle at that point. But all of the curriculum, whether that's attending the cultural class and baking with their mom or dad, or whether that's the restorative circle or this new model we're implementing, it's family structured. And we have strengthening family groups. We paused that a little bit because of COVID. And yeah, so we have multiple programming around working with the children as well. And they're always welcome in the office, and welcome at the classes.
And thank you, Janelle. So we're just about out of time. I'm just going to give an opportunity to Violet to comment on that question briefly, and then we're just going to move into offering the downloads and the webinar certificate. Violet.
Sure, quickly. In thinking about what things that states can do, or I noticed another question about what even is the historical trauma. So I pulled up a couple free publicly available resources that might be helpful, that these facilities or staff members might examine. So one thing that I can't remember if anybody specifically said it, but the Wilbrighty movement is an organization by Don Coyce, and that group has pulled together an assortment of different videos and tools and manuals, and also provides training to better understand the impact of historical trauma. And another term we use is intergenerational trauma. And one way that we see intergenerational trauma as impact today is that it has resulted in our elders and our culture being lost, those teachings being lost. And so then the illness is resulting. We don't know how to raise our children. You see a lot more abuse, a lot more harm and substance use, etc. And they have these downstream negative effects. So I'm just going to throw in the chat here a couple resources. So this first one is an adaptation of motivational interviewing. It's publicly available. It was created by my PhD advisor, Dr. Kamala Vinner at the University of New Mexico, and along with other tribal members from the area in New Mexico and elsewhere. I would recommend anybody who's interested in utilizing motivational interviewing or currently using motivational interviewing in their program to take a look at this manual if you have Native American individuals that you serve. It does provide a different angle at the way that you provide those services. And then also, real quick in the last second, share with you the website of Fulbrighty.com, and would recommend that you look specifically at the White Bison program, which really goes into detail on that historical trauma. Just a couple things that maybe might help educate you or your staff, your facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet. And thank you to our panel today. This was a really rich and informative discussion. I just have a couple of closing slides to cover. First of all, here is the SAMHSA publication on improving cultural competence, and Violet covered some of these, the concepts in this publication in the beginning of her talk. If you'd like to download that now, you should see a file transfer box pop up. If you select the file name and then click the download button, that will start the download process on your computer. We also have on offer today a certificate of attendance if you would like to download that. I'd like to mention also the publication. If you're having any difficulties with the file transfer box, you can also find the publication on the samhsa.gov website. Go to their store online, and it's a free publication, and you can download that directly from SAMHSA's website. And here is information on the GAINS listserv. If you'd like to sign up, if you haven't signed up already, I encourage you to do so. And if you'd like to receive notifications from us on future webinars, trainings, and other opportunities, this is the place to go to sign up to receive those notices. And finally, our contact information here at SAMHSA's GAINS Center. If you have any further comments for us or questions, please feel free to reach out. You should also be seeing a closing poll for the day. This is where we collect information from the audience on any requests for future TA or other information that you would like, and we share that information with SAMHSA. So if you would like to provide feedback there, we collect that all, and that will be submitted for you. So once again, thank you to everyone who participated today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next SAMHSA's GAINS Center event. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.